When Dr. Harold Shipman committed suicide in January 2004, hanging himself in his cell at Wakefield Prison, he took to his grave the details of more than 20 years of killing, fostering an image as a kindly, considerate, and dedicated medical professional. Dr. Shipman had for years cunningly disguised his addiction to drugs and a more sinister fondness for killing his patients. In the months that followed his arrest in September 1998, investigators pieced together a catalog of victims, but struggled to identify a clear motive. While relatives of his victims, disturbed that a respected man could avoid detection for so long, asked simply, how could this happen? For journalist and author Jean Ritchie, Shipman had the perfect cover.
He was able to keep up killing for so long because he was a doctor. He had access to the drugs to kill people with, and he was killing them, generally speaking, in a fairly controlled way. So another old lady dies, it wouldn't raise the same eyebrows as it would if it was a 20-year-old girl.
Former detective Robin Napper describes Shipman as an almost flawless killer.
Dr. Harold Shipman is the closest I've come to serial killer perfection. He is a man who thought everything out from A to Y. Didn't quite get to Z because obviously he got caught. But Harold Shipman was a highly intelligent man.
Harold Frederick Shipman was born on January 14, 1946, and raised in a working-class neighborhood in Nottingham, England. The second of 4 children to Harold, a truck driver, and housewife Vera, he lived a relatively normal childhood in the family's nondescript dwelling on the Bestwood Council estate. An impressive rugby player at school and vice captain of the athletics team, he was, nonetheless, something of a loner. When his mother, who doted on Shipman, was diagnosed with terminal lung cancer in the early 1960s, her son became a willing carer. He was there to assist in her dying days and witnessed firsthand the calming effect of the morphine injections that dulled the pain and comforted his mother to the end. She took her final breaths on June 21, 1963, when Harold Shipman was just 17 years old.
He definitely suffered a huge trauma at the age of 17. His main prop and support system was taken away. He wasn't popular at school. He did play rugby quite well, but he wasn't one of the boys. And he'd been brought up by this mother who kept telling him, you are special, you are very, very special. And he was the apple of her eye. And she died of cancer back in the days before we had syringe drivers and easy treatments for cancer. She died at home, and there were 2 highlights in her day. One was when Fred, as she called him, came home from school and sat with her and made her a cup of tea, and the other, which he witnessed, was when the doctor came round and gave her a shot of morphine.
His mother was the biggest influence in Harold Shipman's life. When his mother became ill, to his credit, he did actually nurse her, but he saw how she went downhill very, very quickly and died in great pain. She had cancer and died in great pain. That had a big effect on him.
Initially, the passing of his mother appeared to be a positive motivation for the teenager, who had set his mind on a career as a doctor. In 1965, he started studying at Leeds School of Medicine, and the following year married Primrose May Oxtoby. She was 17 years old and 5 months pregnant with the first of 4 children to Shipman. He completed his degree in 1970, the lessons he had learned in saving lives already shaping as the method of his future madness. He had the manual for death, and lethal injections would soon become the modus operandi of the world's most prolific serial killer. Shipman started work at Pontefract General Infirmary in West Yorkshire before moving on to Abraham Ormerid Medical Center, where the first signs that his caring veneer was no more than skin deep started to appear. Shipman and Primrose already had 2 children, but it seemed fatherhood was no distraction to his evil aims. Caught forging pethidine prescriptions, Shipman was fined £600. What should have set alarm bells ringing was a wake-up call only to Shipman. Rather than being struck off the medical register, he received psychiatric treatment in York.
I mean, we do know he had an addictive personality. He lost his first job in practice for being addicted to pethidine, and he was sent away into rehab for that. So he obviously had and that had probably started at medical school. So he had been stealing pethidine prescriptions then, forging them for his own habit.
Shipman returned to work as a GP, revitalizing his career in Greater Manchester. It was here, in England's gritty industrial north, that Harold Shipman rolled out a pattern of calculated killing, all the while upholding an image as a caring doctor, whose house visits were part of the service. The man his admiring patients saw was not the man he was.
He created the whole climate to get the perfect, almost fantasy. Now, what he used to do was this. He realized that the perfect woman for him was an elderly white lady. He liked elderly white ladies. He got a reputation for being a caring doctor, a brilliantly good doctor for elderly people. So they used to come to him. People would introduce them to him, and he would look after them. He would understand their aches and pains, and he would then go and visit them unannounced in the home, and every time they opened the door and it was Dr. Harold, they thought this was fantastic. This man is so caring that during his day he's coming to see how I am.
He normally visited an old lady in the afternoon. That's why there were lots of newspaper headlines, death in the afternoon. After morning surgery, he'd pop round to see some elderly patient who would welcome him because he was the loving, kind doctor. And he'd say, I'm just coming to, check your blood pressure, see how you're getting on, everything going okay. I'll just give you this quick vitamin injection, make you feel better.
What they didn't realise, he was feeling that way, and he wanted to make sure that there was no one else there. And if there was someone else there, it used to enhance his reputation. They said, I was around Lily's house and the doctor turned up unannounced, had a cup of tea. What a wonderful doctor. He built up this fantastic reputation. They didn't realise there was a dark side to this man.
He'd give them an injection and they would fall quietly to sleep, usually with their cup of tea going cold next to them. They sat in their chairs, he rolled their sleeves up to give them the injection, and that is exactly how they were found. Sometimes he pulled the sleeves down.
Criminologist and author Christopher Berry D questions Shipman's motivation.
Dr. Shipman's motive for killing could be 2 or 3-fold. We don't really know. There wasn't a sexual element, in as far as he's not going to get sexual gratification by the act of killing. Why would he kill? Is it some God thing that God's told him to do it? He doesn't say. He just does it. He injects them with this morphine. He's addicted to it. He's the most arrogant piece of work you could ever want to meet.
There appears to have been no violence in Shipman's considered method, just the prick of a needle and a short, sharp, lethal injection of diamorphine to bring sleep, darkness, and death to his victims. Most were elderly women. The availability of pharmaceutical heroin and access to a queue of older patients made killing easy for Dr. Death. And there was something else.
Because most serial killers have a problem disposing of bodies. He could use the system. He knew the system back to front. He would write the death certificate, he would arrange the undertakers, he would dispose of all his bodies through the system, and nobody ever questioned him when he used to do that.
In terms of post-mortems, unless there is a real need for it, the relatives have the right to say no to a post-mortem, and he played on that. He'd say, oh, you don't want to see Gran chopped up in a mortuary, do you? You don't want to see Auntie Vi being cut apart. And so people would say no to a post-mortem. But if it's just a sort of medical inquiry death, the relatives have the right to say no, and he always encouraged them to say no. And he always encouraged them to have a cremation because he didn't want the remains.
The mounting number of Shipman's patients who were dying didn't go unnoticed by everyone.
A taxi driver in Hyde, he was an retired gentleman. He didn't go on the taxi rank taking the drunks home from the pub on a Saturday night. He had his own little clientele of elderly ladies who he shipped to the bingo, or he took them to the supermarket or the railway station. And he would go home and say to his wife, another one has died, and she'd say, another Shipman's. And he actually wrote them down in the back of his notebook and gave it to the police.
No one questioned him until 1998, when an undertaker in Hyde, Greater Manchester, became suspicious of the number of Shipman's patients who had died. Deborah Massey from Frank Massey and Sons Funeral Parlor was on to something.
She started going out on home visits on there, and she was struck by the number of times they, as the undertakers, would arrive and Dr. Harold Shipman would already be there. Normally, they would be either met by the relatives or the police or some, but it was always Dr. Harold, always Dr. Harold. So she mentioned it to her family, and they sort of said, well, he cares a lot, he's got an elderly community. And she said, no, there's something not right about this. She was absolutely spot on right at that time, and it bugged her. So one day, she had to go to Harold Shipman's office to get some paperwork on one of their recent bereavements, and he was writing it. He was writing the paperwork at his desk, and she sort of brought up the subject. She said, Doctor, she said, I find it unusual that every time we turn up there, you're there before us. He didn't flinch. He didn't change his mental thinking. He carried on writing, and when he finished, he looked her in the eyes. He said, I care about my patients.
The death of Shipman's patients was later found to be 10 times higher than the average for a medical practice.
You always have a second doctor to sign a cremation certificate. He was in single-handed practice, so he used to go across to another surgery across the road and get somebody to sign, and a woman there, a really caring, thoughtful doctor, who sadly died of cancer before she saw him brought to justice. She alerted the authorities. She said, I'm signing far too many cremation certificates for Shipman.
Concerns were reported to the local coroner and passed on to the police, whose investigation was so inadequate they didn't even contact Shipman or the relatives of the patients who had died. Checks made of 19 deceased patients found no inconsistencies between the cause of death and the doctor's notes. Shipman was allowed to continue to practice, killing 3 more people before he was finally arrested.
Why is this man, with a history of drug abuse and other things that we should have been struck off the medical register for years ago, is allowed to practice where he's coming into contact with other doctors, psychiatrists and psychologists on a day-to-day basis, and they don't even know he's a serial killer. And if anybody should do, they do. But the buck stops with the health service that employed him for not carrying out due diligence and for the failure to keep medication those days under lock and key and controlled. The buck stops, and I've said it before, not just with Shipman, but the people that employed him.
Killing had been easy, disposal of the evidence easier still. But when Shipman forged the will of one of his victims, Kathleen Grundy, so that £386,000 was left to Shipman, he made a crucial mistake that would bring an end to his killings.
This was a woman who may have been 80, but the week before she died, she leapt off a bus at the traffic lights. And when the landlady of a local pub heard she died, she said, oh, what, was she knocked over? Because nobody could believe she would have died of natural causes in any other way. She was a very fit, active member of the community. She spent her time cooking meals for the elderly, didn't regard herself as elderly, and then suddenly she's dead.
He had not counted on Grundy's daughter, Angela Woodruff, who refused to believe the death of her otherwise sprightly elderly mother was anything less than suspicious. Woodruff, a respected lawyer, identified the badly typed will as a fake that simply would not have been written by her meticulous mother. After she raised her suspicion with police, Shipman's killing was at an end. Kathleen Grundy's body was exhumed in August 1998, and she was found to have morphine in her body. Police exhumed a further 11 victims over the following months.
The bodies that they did exhume from Dr. Shipman had these massive doses of diamorphine, so clearly something had happened. He was interviewed, and from all accounts, he controlled the interview. He thought he was superior to the police officers. He was cleverer than them, he was cleverer than the lawyer, he was cleverer than the system. He was in perfect control of what he was actually doing. And it wasn't until the police investigation went deeper and deeper and deeper into Dr. Harold Shipman, they suddenly drew up this possibility that this man hadn't just killed a few, he had killed well, it looks like hundreds, probably up to 250. And people were saying, oh my God, this has been going on under our noses all these years. During the police interview, when Harold Shipman realised the game was up, he stopped talking, said, no, I'm not saying anything further, never said another word. He realised then that the game was up, never said another word.
Police later considered the theft may have been Shipman's motivation, with around 10,000 pounds worth of jewelry found stashed in his garage. During the trial, Shipman remained steadfast, denying his guilt and concocting stories about his patient's drug dependency and addiction. Crucially, computer records, hardly thought of during the early years of Shipman's medical career, revealed a flaw in methodology in his pattern of murder. Although Shipman craftily amended patient medical records to suit his purposes immediately after their death, the computer date stamping revealed the truth of his forgeries. Shipman's trial had begun on October 5, 1999, and on January 31st the following year, after 6 days of deliberation, the jury found him guilty of 15 counts of murder and 1 of forgery. The true extent of Shipman's killing spree was laid bare during subsequent investigations and inquiries.
He was convicted and he went to prison, never ever confessed, never admitted he'd done wrong. His family and a lot of his supporters still think that the system was wrong, that Dr. Harold was a brilliant doctor and he's been maligned. And there's the others that think that he's just a dreadful serial killer. I'm, for one, I'm on the serial killer side. I can see how controlling he was, how good he was, how he used to get his kicks. He beat the system for most of his life, and if it hadn't have been for that will, he'd still be operating today.
He was a killer. He was a ruthless killer. He was a killer who killed again and again and again and again, and it accelerated and he couldn't stop himself. He definitely had a feeling of being in control, choosing when someone would die because he was this godlike figure.
In July 2002, the Shipman inquiry concluded the doctor had killed at least 215 of his patients between 1975 and 1998. Dame Janet Smith, who submitted the report, admitted there were many more suspicious deaths in the catalog linked to Dr. Death. Between 1971 and the death of his last known victim in 1998, 459 patients died while under his care. Smith surmised that 250 people were victims of his 27 years of killing. Shipman's wife maintained her husband's innocence even after his conviction. Although in the days leading to his suicide, Shipman's cellmate claimed Primrose had written to her husband, pleading with him to tell her everything, no matter what. Harold Shipman never did. Instead, he ended his own life, tying bedsheets to his prison cell bars and hanging himself. He was pronounced dead at 8:10 a.m. on January 13, 2004.
There's been many rumours as to why Shipman hung himself. An insurance payout for his family? No. Was he distressed? No. The only reason that he hung himself, and we're not inside his head, is because he realised that his life was finished. He had nothing, nobody else to control, no patients to look after, and the very thought of him killing himself to help his family would have been the furthest thing from his mind.
For those whose loved ones were the victims of his cold, calculated crimes, there was only an emptiness that could not be filled by his death. Doctors are supposed to save lives. Dr. Harold Frederick Shipman was something else.
There's not a day that goes by that people are not outside taking photographs, pointing and looking at it, that this is the house of horrors that Dorothea Puente operated.
59-year-old Dorothea Puente had an almost perfect disguise. Age was on her side, so too her small stature and unimposing frame. And as the manager of a care home for alcoholics, drug addicts, and others less fortunate, she also appeared to be considerate and kindly. So when police detective John Cabrera first knocked on her door during his investigation into the disappearance of mentally disabled Bert Montoya, it was for information, and not the haul of bodies he would eventually find.
She comes to the door, she answers it. There's myself, my partner Terry Brown, and her parole officer. And I introduce myself and everyone, and she just looks at us and says, "Well, I was expecting you gentlemen."
Puente, who was on parole, admitted to Detective John Cabrera that she'd been running an illegal care home that also breached the terms of her conditional release. But she claimed to know nothing of the whereabouts of Bert Montoya.
She was kind of a grandmotherly type. She had a nice little chiffon dress on. Her hair was done well, and she had her makeup on and everything. So, she just didn't look like that from the first time I saw her. I've had to kind of look because she just didn't appear to me to be capable of doing anything that, the social worker had thought might have happened to, her care person. While my partner and her parole officer stayed back with her, I immediately searched the premises, basically looking for Bert. By some chance he was stuffed in a closet or under a bed or something. I wanted to make sure that I'd covered all those bases. But Bert was about 6 feet tall, 250 pounds, so you couldn't hide him, very easily.
The search conducted at Puente's Sacramento residence in 1988 uncovered nothing of immediate interest. So Cabrera turned his attention to the garden after social worker Judy Moyes told him of her previous observations of piles of soil on the property.
To be truthful, I have no clue on what we are about to find. No clue.
It didn't take long for Detective Cabrera to excavate several small holes in the garden where he hit something hard.
I climbed down in the hole and I dug around it, not knowing yet what it was, but I grabbed it with both my hands and I was yanking on it. And I kept yanking and yanking and yanking it in hopes to dislodge it. And then all of a sudden it came loose. And when I fell back in the back of the hole, I looked up and there was a bone in my hand, a human bone. And right there we stopped everything.
At this early stage of the investigation into the disappearance of Bert Montoya, Dorothea Puente was no more than the owner of a property of interest.
Why didn't we arrest her? Because simply we didn't have enough information to arrest her, or what we called, enough probable cause to arrest her. We had some bones, and from all likelihood, we knew it wasn't going to be Bert because Bert's only been missing for 3 months. This is an area that goes way back, into the 1800s, and somebody could have easily been buried there, because going back that long ago, there were no ordinances about, where people had to be buried or anything like that. On the second day, I was digging in an area that just bothered me because it was just basically she had poured cement over the dirt, and then she made some little holes and then put rose bushes through. But I thought to myself, that's just odd. I mean, one person might look at it and say, well, she didn't want any weeds, so she just poured concrete. But I took the concrete up and started digging. And it was at that time that I was digging that I looked up and she was on the balcony of the house looking at me. And so I just continued to dig, and then I looked up and she was gone.
Detective John Cabrera's early impression of Dorothea Puente as an unlikely killer, and the initial unearthing of bones and not a body, gave the elderly murderer an opportunity to escape, even before she was a suspect. As Cabrera poked around in the soil, Puente asked him a question.
Am I under arrest? And I kind of caught me by surprise, and I thought, wow. And I said, no, you've been cooperative, you've given permission. No, you're not going to be arrested right now. And I said, why do you ask? And she said, well, all of this is making me nervous, and I would like to go have a cup of coffee with my nephew around the corner. And so I said, okay, well, get what you need, and then I'll walk you over there because there's some people forming outside. So I did walk her over to where this hotel was, and the last thing I saw was she'd gone in through the back. Of course, I go back and I start digging again. And it was about maybe 20 minutes, me digging. I pulled the ground, I lifted up, and there was a human leg in my shovel. And that when everything just started to speed up. And I called over and told my commander to get over here. I found another one. And he said, well, where is Dorothea? And I said, I walked her over to the coffee shop. So he ran over there. And a few minutes later, he comes back and he's out of breath and he says, you know, where did you say she was? And at that point I knew, uh-oh.
Psychiatrist Dr. William Vickery was called in to assist the case.
I think it started accidentally when one of the tenants at her board and care home died under her care, and she was fearful that the authorities would say that this was because of something that she had done, and it kind of paralyzed her, and she made the wrong decision to bury this person on the property and just forget about the person and hope that nobody would ever discover it.
Dorothea Puente was born Dorothea Helen Gray in San Bernardino County, California on the 9th of January, 1924. By the time she was 10 years old, she'd been orphaned. She became pregnant for the first time when she was 17 and had a second child the following year. She would also marry 4 times during a turbulent life that was marked by criminality.
She also had a streak of larceny running through her, dating back to when she was younger, where she had committed property crimes, partly out of desperation and trying to obtain money to support herself, and partly in an effort to get enough money where she could be regarded as a person of means, somebody. This was a lifelong quest of hers, to be admired and respected by other people, because it had never been the case in her life that anybody had ever viewed her in that way. She was forced by circumstances to put her own 2 daughters up for adoption. I think it was having been neglected and abused and every which way, verbally, physically, and sexually, and really having nobody to be her rescuer or helper, that when she would see somebody that reminded of her when she was a little girl, she wanted to help, because she knew what it was like. She was capable of having empathy for others and to be a person that was willing to put herself out to help other people. In fact, she made a career out of rehabilitating homeless alcoholic derelicts. And that traces back to her childhood, because her family was replete with abusive alcoholics.
In 1966, her marriage to Roberto Puente, who was almost 20 years younger, consummated a name that would resonate through history. Within 2 years, their bond had been broken, and soon after, Dorothea took up residence in Sacramento, where Detective John Cabrera had found himself digging through garden soil more than 2 decades later.
I started pulling out pieces of cloth and little things like that. And I also was pulling out some shreds of what looked to be like shoe leather. It was kind of opaque in color and, kind of rigid around the edges, and I'd piled it up. And later I would find out during the investigation that what I was actually taking out of the ground was human flesh that had just simply dried in the ground that belonged to my victim in the ground.
In allowing Puente the courtesy of a trip to the local coffee shop, Cabrera had let slip the woman who was about to become the prime suspect.
We knew that immediately everything in that yard was coming up. All the little sheds, all the little patios that she had built, all the structure she'd put on the property, it was all coming down. And we were going to turn that ground upside down, and which we did. We come up through here, and there was another area right up in this area. And We remove the built-up patio here, and underneath it we find another victim. And not only this one, as we move back into the back of the yard, and it would be against the back fence back there, we would dig down and find Bert. So again, when we were removing these structures, it seemed like every structure that was built out here that she had put in the yard, every time we'd remove one and dig underneath it, we found a body. So we just continued to dig, and as we dug more and more, it was one body after another we kept finding, until we ended up with 7. And the last one being in the front yard, right about 4 feet from the sidewalk that people and pedestrians walked every day. Every day.
Puente's time on the run would last a matter of days. A nationwide police response and media exposure that focused on the unearthing of bodies at the Sacramento Garden led to her recapture in Los Angeles.
She was staying at the Royal Viking Hotel, and she went over to a nearby bar. And she met a gentleman in there, and they got to talking, and she ran a story by him that, you know, she was down here, something about her husband had passed away, and she was by herself and going to spend Thanksgiving down here. And she had basically asked him if he wanted to spend some time with her. And of course, you know, he didn't really want much to do with her. He listened to her, talked to her, but she said, hey, you know, here's where I'm staying. If you're interested, you know, come on over. And he left the bar and went home. And while he's home, he's watching TV, and lo and behold, who shows up on the newscast is this wanted information about this woman, Dorothea Puente, and he's looking right at the TV. He sees it, he calls LAPD, tells them, look, the woman that's wanted, I'm watching on TV, I was just with her. And of course, I don't find out until I'm home late at night and I'm watching the news, and there she is parading across the TV screen in the custody of the Los Angeles Police Department. And I felt very relieved at that time that she was in custody.
As more bodies were dug up from Puente's Sacramento home, police began to piece together a possible motive. Outwardly displaying the characteristics of a matronly caregiver, Puente had easily gained the trust of others, who were content to live according to her sometimes strict rules.
This down here is the bottom quarters of the residence, and this is where all of the victims resided. They stayed here, and they had their own kitchen, and there were several rooms inside this area. But this is where all the victims resided. The only people that stayed on top was Dorothea and one of her close friends who stayed on the back porch area. But that was it. Nobody was ever allowed to come up onto the top up there unless she invited them. The only other person that was allowed to wander freely on top and the bottom and anywhere was Bert. Bert was childlike. He always would follow Dorothea, referred to her as Mama, and so she felt that he was of no threat. And so he could walk freely around the house without any issue. But as far as any other tenant or resident here, they could not set foot up there unless she invited them.
Puente collected their mail, cashed their welfare checks, and provided for her boarders, all the while having direct control over their finances. It was a brazen method Puente had used before, having been previously convicted of fraud conducted in similar circumstances.
She was cashing friends and gentlemen that she knew their Social Security check. But what she was doing also is she was putting some type of a drug in their drink when she was there for the evening with them. And after they passed out from this drug, she would take their Social Security checks, jewelry, things like that. And ultimately, she got caught for it.
But sentencing and incarceration failed to curb Puente's fraud. And by the time she was running the boarding house in Sacramento, she had added a more sinister action to her methods. She had turned to murder, drugging and then suffocating her victims before disposing the bodies in her garden.
She kept the victims here lying on the floor for 1 to 2, maybe 3 weeks. It's hard to say, but it was long enough that the body fluids were able to drain from the body and seep through the carpet down into the woodwork. So this is the death room. From here, the bodies were then taken here through the kitchen, out to the back porch, and down the stairwell. This is the way all of the victims exited this house, was through these stairs. This is where we would find our final victim in the property. This was Betty Palmer. And what was most disturbing about this particular victim is that when we had brought her up out of the ground and we were able to take a look at her, she had no head, no arms, and no legs. And unlike any of the other victims, she had actually dismembered this victim, probably in hopes of not being able to identify if she was ever found.
If Puente could get rid of the bodies without anybody knowing, she could also continue to reap the proceeds of the incoming welfare checks.
It was just pure greed, just greed. The fact that she could do this and get away with it with little or no evidence, I think just kept building up as far as what she was doing, and she really felt that she would never get caught. Never. The way she was doing it. The people that stayed there, the people that were placed in her home, these are people that had a lot of issues. They're elderly, alcoholic. They had a lot of issues, and so they didn't have a whole lot of family that would come and visit them. So them missing, them leaving, or them being reported gone didn't really raise any suspicion to family members, to anybody. It was just like, well, they left, and they moved on. And she was hoping that this would continue as far as the way they were missing. And then, of course, when somebody was missing, that opened up space, so they would bring somebody else in. So, she had quite a business running there. One would miss, she could fill the spot again. And, of course, she was the only one that went down and collected the mail at the end of each month, because what comes in the mail? Social Security checks. And she would sign them and put them in the bank. And then, of course, she would feed her tenants. They could drink all they wanted to on a local tab from a bar that was just across the street. So for them, it was a pretty good deal. And for her, it was an easy deal, that she could have all this control of money and, do what she wanted with it. I think she kind of thought of herself as being able to do things that would go undetected. I thought she felt that the way she could act around people, way above suspicion, especially in a neighborhood setting, that she could get away with a lot, and no one around her would ever find out.
After police found 7 bodies in her garden, further investigation led to the discovery of more cases implicating Puente as killer. Police linked her to the 1982 murder of Ruth Monroe, a former friend of Puente, whose death had previously been considered suicide. Puente was also charged with the murder of Everson Gilmouth, whose remains had been found in a coffin-like box on the banks of a river in 1986. Gilmouth had corresponded with Puente during a previous jail term she had served, and the pair later lived together. When police completed their investigation, Dorothea Puente was charged with killing 9 people, although the cause of death was not established. The 9 lives taken were Leona Carpenter, Betty Palmer, Dorothy Miller, Vera Faye Martin, James Gallup, Benjamin Fink, Bert Montoya, Ruth Monroe, and Everson Gilmouth. Dr. William Vickery conducted a series of interviews with Puente to establish whether her mental condition was relevant to the criminal prosecution.
My first impression of Dorothea was that she was an elderly woman who seemed very unlikely to have committed the series of murders that were alleged to have occurred at her hands. So it was bewildering how a relatively small woman could be capable of killing many of her victims who were large men.
Well, there's no doubt someone helped her. Somebody helped her, but she would never at any time ever admit to whoever helped her.
The intense public scrutiny forced authorities to move the trial from Sacramento to Monterey, fearing the jury would be influenced by the publicity surrounding the case. Dorothea Puente was charged with 9 murders. Some 5 years after her initial arrest, She was found guilty of 2 first-degree murders and 1 count of second-degree murder. Throughout the trial and in the years following her incarceration, Dorothea Puente maintained her innocence, claiming the deceased had died of natural causes. None of this could explain the burials and the brutal dismemberment of Betty Palmer.
No, she was not insane. She did not suffer from a psychotic mental illness. She never lost touch with reality. She was completely aware of her actions and the repercussions of her actions.
Dorothea Puente avoided the death sentence and was instead ordered to spend the rest of her life in prison, the trigger for her crimes remaining a personally held secret. Though experts could speculate over the reasons for her crimes, Puente was not prepared to answer the question, why?
The explanation from a mental health perspective is that if they knew the answer to that question, they probably wouldn't have committed the crimes in the first place. You see? I mean, there's a source for all this hostility and rage and anger that explodes in these homicides, which to the outside person look like they're so cruel and senseless. But there's a psychology behind that. Many of these people have had a very traumatic upbringing in which they have been hardened and taught that to ask for help or to say that they're hurting or that they're afraid brings nothing but contempt and abuse upon them.
Dorothea, in my opinion, was a woman that more like a chameleon. At one time, she could be really a good person to her friends, neighbors, and on the other hand, she could quickly change to a very, mean, very aggressive individual.
After avoiding the death penalty and instead being interned with a life term, Dorothea Puente lived behind bars for almost 23 years before dying of natural causes in a California prison in 2011.